Hi. Hi. Everyone online, if you have any issues with the sound, give us a wee shout. My name is Myri. I'm a lighthouse at a most radical bookshop, and it is such a pleasure to be hosting Arielle Burgdorf tonight in the bookshop. We are going to be talking about Jeanne,
Sure.
Which is just such a whip-smart roller coaster ride of a novel that has been such a journey, and I've loved every page. And before we get into our chat, I'm just going to give you a few words about, is it Arielle?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, making sure I'm saying that right. Arielle is an author and literary translator from French. They're interested in the intersections of language, gender, sexuality, and art. Their first novel, Prétend, was published in January 2024 by the End of the Line Press, and a new edition, and a new UK edition, Jeanne, comes out May 2025 from Moist Books, which is this one. Do you want to set us off with a little reading from the book?
Yeah, I'd love to. So the first thing I'm going to read is from the very beginning of the book, so there's not much you need to know. And then the second short one I wanted to do, the main character has traveled to Germany. Yeah, I'll introduce that one when I get to that one, I guess. So, part 1, Trouble. In Montreal, Jeanne comes undone. Shuffling between borders, currencies, and time zones, countless imaginary markers she doesn't believe in, the old Jeanne dissolves. She slips. She becomes slippage, slippery. The markers blur and blur until finally they blur the very silhouette of self. When everything breaks down, what is left of her? She's not sure. Bored in her airplane seat, ass numb, she anxiously waits to get off. She tugs at the black thread unraveling on one side of her jeans. She can't stop pulling as it grows longer and longer until finally, in one violent movement, she rips it free of the denim. Afterwards, she goes through customs, casually sidestepping the question of business or pleasure. It's always a bit of both. She enters the terminal, the fakely cheerful red Tim Hortons sign alerting her that she is home. Toujours frais. Somewhere in the terminal, Jeanne becomes Jeanne. The pronunciation of her name shifts from Jeanne to something closer to John or Jeanne, depending on who is saying it. She trades Montreal for Montréal, Dunkin' for Tim's, Speedway for Couche-Tard, Corner Store for Dépanneur, and fuck for her grandfather's expression, Christ de Calice de Tabarnakteski de Sacrement. That one makes her smile. Nothing comes close to the Quebecois art of swearing. She's home, but this isn't really her home. She hasn't been to Montreal in years. Although she was born here, she's forever an outsider. If home means a place you belong, a place you are understood without having to explain yourself, then no, Jeanne does not have a home. She has no mother tongue. Her mother is dead and her father is missing. She's not a citizen of anywhere in particular. Jeanne orders a cup of black coffee from Tim's that she drinks on the curb outside while smoking her first cigarette of the day. The coffee is way too hot, scraping a layer of skin off her tongue. The cigarette is perfect. That afternoon, she wanders Boulevard Saint-Laurent, known by some old-timers as the Main, searching for a cafe where she can write. Jeanne is a translator. Well, she's trying to be a translator. She's here in Montreal for a translation job that she's not sure will come through. Part of her is convinced the whole thing is a scam, a sadistic joke, that there was no job for her to begin with. But she's used to taking on any translation projects that come her way, and this one pays particularly well. Her obsession with translation springs from growing up between and around, circling many languages, many cultures. And perhaps she has something to prove, to show she knows her languages inside and out, even when she is not sure she does, even when she is not sure anyone can ever know a language so intimately. She's trying to recover her roots, to understand her absent parents through her work. She believes the role of a translator is sacred, somewhere between conspirator and midwife. Yeah, I'll fast forward a bit. So Jeanne meets a romantic interest, I guess, And they go to Germany, they go to Berlin, and there's a bit of like romantic competition with another woman who's there named Safiye, but I think that's pretty much it. She's still a translator and she's in Berlin for this part. Okay, so this chapter is called, or section is called Masculine Féminin. The next day was Sunday, so Safiye took them to Mauer Park for the flea market. The park was bustling with locals and tourists, people selling souvenirs, old clothes, and fried food. Jeanne stopped to inspect a cluster of yellowing books splayed out on a blanket. She decided on a cheap copy of Simone de Beauvoir's The Woman Destroyed. She'd read the stories before, and they were far from her favorite of de Beauvoir's. She wanted it because the reprint cover was gorgeous. A pink background with a pair of floating lips smothered in green lipstick, smoking a cigarette. For €3, she could own a little portable work of art and adore something just for the sake of its beauty. When Constantine asked her why she bought it, she was embarrassed and didn't mention the cover. "I'm trying to read more short stories," she said. He bought her a pair of silver earrings in the shape of snakes. They had little green stones embedded in them that were supposed to be scales. "If you're going to have hair that short, you might as well wear earrings," he said. She put them on. She didn't usually wear earrings anymore, but she would wear these for a little while to make him happy. "I was right, they look great with your hair," Constantine said, claiming victory. She liked that her short haircut showed off her long neck and made her look androgynous. People said she resembled Jean Seberg in St. Joan, but with crooked teeth. They would usually add reassuringly that they liked crooked teeth. But Jean wanted to look like Maria Falconetti in La Passion de Jeanne d'Arc. People complained that Seberg's good looks were frivolous in this situation, distracting from the seriousness the role required. What Jean wanted above all was to be taken seriously. She'd had short hair her entire life. It was a utilitarian choice more than an aesthetic one. She saved a lot of money on hair care and salons, but she couldn't deny that it had become part of her identity. She'd never grown out of her tomboy phase, or maybe there was more to it than that. She always found it interesting that the French term for tomboy was garçon manqué, not a perfect equivalent. Rather than boyish girl, it means failed boy, pretend boy, deficient boy. This reminded her of Judeo-Christian attitudes that Eve was ultimately leftovers made from Adam. Women as imitations, sloppy translations of male originals. But Jean actually preferred garçon manqué because it more accurately captured how she felt. Never a tomboy, but a counterfeit man. She didn't even want to be a man, but still felt as though, at some point, she had failed at the task of becoming one. She played the part of a gamine, maybe too much so. Imitating a man caused trouble. She remembered Patti Smith telling a story about running into Allen Ginsberg at a diner. He thought she was a young man, flirting with her and offering to buy her a sandwich. When he realized he'd made a mistake, he was deeply upset. "Can I still have the sandwich?" she dared to ask. In French, everything has to agree in case, number, gender. Elles aiment le cinéma. Elle, third person, plural, feminine. In the real world, everything has to agree in face, body, gender. Soft face and makeup, curves, female. Everything has to agree, or there will be problems. A man kissed Jean in a dark bar once, believing she was also a man. When he felt one of her breasts, he yelled and shoved her hard. "Can I still have the sandwich?" To Jean, it made no difference. She didn't see herself as a girl or a boy. She was a pair of lips floating in the night.
Thank you for that. What perfect little introductions to the incredible foreshadowing that you have layered into that opening chapter, but also the precision of your language. And so I want to start by sort of asking about like the writing of this book and the writing of this book as a translator and as someone whose craft is words. How do you approach telling a story? Like, did Jeanne come first and then it was her story to tell? Did you have a story and themes you wanted to explore, and this was the vehicle for it? Like, how did you come to the novel that became? Yes.
That's a good question. I think I had read the novel I was talking to you about before this began. It's called Mauve Désert, or in English it's The Desert Mauve, by Nicole Brossard, and it's a novel that's like dealing with theoretical ideas about translation in fiction, through fiction. And so I wanted to do something like that with translation theory, and I was reading a lot of translation theory, and I was very angry about a lot of the translation theory I was reading. And then, yeah, I think the very beginning part where she's like on the airplane and going through customs, that did just kind of like come to me, and the image of her sort of came to me, and so then I kind of let her, I think whenever I wrote it, I don't know if it was like during the beginning of like pandemic stuff, but I feel like I was not traveling, and I wanted to at least travel in my head, and I think that's why there's like quite a lot of movement. There's a lot of like going to different countries in quick succession, and then I was like, I think much like me, maybe this character is running from something and needs to like sit down and deal with it. Yeah, so that's, I think, how it developed.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yes, no, it does. I'm intrigued by, so there is all this movement, and there's, you get to travel with the language, you get to travel with the people and their backstory travel of where they've been, and like place is quite important, but also kind of superfluous. It just happens to be where they are going next or running from. And I wonder, like, in terms of place and language and the languages that go into it. So the love, how would I describe Constantine? The love interest.
Piece of shit, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so the very sexy man in the house in the bar in Iceland, who turns out to not be, he's Russian. She's French Canadian. Sort of. Canadian American. You've got German, then in the languages in the book is scattered with French, but also French Canadian with Russian. You've got the German. Yeah, so how did you, when you were deciding on place and that connection between language and place, how did you decide, like, what were the languages gonna be?
Okay. So I think French was like an obvious one because I was already reading a lot of French Canadian stuff. My PhD is about French Canadian writers. It's the one I felt confident in, like I can write stuff in French and it'll be okay. And I still had a friend from Marseille like check everything over for me, you know. And then Russian. So my grandfather was born in Russia, and my grandmother was like one generation more born in Russia. So I sort of felt like because I had that heritage, it was something I could like critique, I guess. I had like more license to critique it.
Cool.
And it's a language I've desperately wanted to learn for a very long time. I don't really have any Russian skills at this point. I found like early on, so I know a lot of, I took French, Latin, Italian, and Japanese, I believe, in like kind of high school and undergrad. And Japanese was when I learned like another alphabet. It was too far, like a bridge too far for me, and I couldn't. So that's kind of why I don't feel great about my learning Russian. But I don't know, there's something about it. It's just like a very, I think, kind of intimidating language. It's a very intimidating kind of culture. There's obviously like a lot of negative things in Russian history and currently happening. So it's not like, and there is this kind of like hatred between America and Russia that's always been there. You know, there's always this like tension between that. So on the one hand, it's like easy to just have a Russian villain, but I wasn't really thinking about that. I was thinking about like a lot of the people several people in my life who are Russian who I love very much, you know, and I tried to like, I have a character who's partially Russian to kind of balance that out, to be like, you know, not all Russians like this, but also, yeah, I don't know. So my friend Ian helped me with he's a Russian, he's married to a Ukrainian, but he's a Russian translator.
Right.
And he helped me with the Russian parts. I think also there's like a part in the book where like I just think the Cyrillic is really interesting, and I think spell out the English word bitch in the Cyrillic font, and it was just thinking about like visually what things look like when you don't speak the language, and like your brain is like trying to make sense of it and like create order and sort of like assimilate everything, and it's not at all, you know, it doesn't I'm sure it's complete nonsense in Russian. And then German, I think it was just I had spent a lot of time in Berlin, and then I knew a little bit of German, obviously my last name, German heritage as well. So those were kind of the ones I felt like, and then English, obviously, I felt complete license to play with. And then I didn't want to like appropriate anything or like take things that weren't like mine, especially like racially, to kind of play around with. So I tried to sort of draw on like my experiences and my heritage.
Cool. I found it really interesting the way like the Russian, and obviously we will all engage with language differently depending on the languages that we have. And so I'm fluent in French, but I don't often read it, but I can encounter it on the page and make the switch almost to a point where I haven't realized that I've switched from one language to another.
It's very cool.
But the Russian is impenetrable. And so it seemed to me, without that it added a layer of Constantine's impenetrability, or that mysterious thing of the closed off man and what might be hidden or hiding, or that he, you know, that it allowed on the page that like disconnect from like, you will not know this man or what he is saying, and you only get him through her eyes. Was that like a conscious choice where you're like, most of my readers will not understand the Russian?
I mean that's definitely how it ended up being. I don't know that I was like assuming that necessarily. It also depends like where you're having readers, you know. But I very consciously made like all of his lines, I think, in Russian. Most of them are like curses, or they're very like negative. And some of the things you can like kind of maybe figure out from context clues, but I did want him to
like
be
the
kind
anger or the cruelty that comes through in those moments.
But then there's also a part where he, I guess it's a spoiler, but he says "I love you" in Russian, right? So there's a balance or a mixture. But I did want him to be kind of mysterious and impenetrable, and like this forebodings. Like I feel like from the very second you meet him, you're like, this isn't gonna go well, because you don't really know what's gonna happen, but you know, like, So, and then I was thinking about like the sound of his name too. I think I mentioned like it's like Jeanne thinks it sounds like a herd of galloping horses. Like it's a very kind of like imperial name. Constantine. Has like a gravity to it, I guess.
With the way the words sit on the page, I'm also curious about like, this is like, it's quite an experimental novel. It's pretty bold at just being like, this is how you're gonna read it, whether that's like the conversations that happen in it, the bits that are written in various languages, but also it sits on the page increasingly the further you go in, almost like poetry, which has its own rhythm that also seems to mimic a kind of undoing of her mind and how much she's processing. And I want to ask about how that went from your brain onto the page, and then how that was to publish or like communicate to get a publisher who would get that you were going to have to literally scatter some things across the page.
I think that actually might have been Moist's idea. So with Pretend, I did a bunch of things with the diacritics, and initially I think it was just like I want to play around with like what I can do on the page, how much I can do on how much I can get away with, I guess, basically. And then like with Oulipo, like I was taking some stuff out of their book, so there's a part that has like no e's in it and things like that, where I was just like doing little like experiments throughout, kind of. But I did want it to be sort of intense and escalating, because like you said, like her mind is kind of unraveling. And I'm like writing this story about this person who, like, she's not really eating, she's drinking a bunch, she's in an abusive relationship, she's like jet lagged, like it's gonna catch up with you eventually, kind of thing. So that's, I wanted that to be kind of reflected in language, and her anxiety to be reflected in language. And I think she also says like her translation gets worse and better at some points. And so I did have a bunch of like accent marks in the original, and that was sort of ramped up as her mind is whatever. And then we were kind of trying to figure out what to do with it. And then I think the editor initially, he was like, can you put diacritical marks like everywhere in the book and see how that looks? And we did that, and it took forever. And then he was like, actually, can you get rid of all of them? So that was a long process, actually. Yeah, but I think it was, I'm trying to remember, but yeah, I made the page with all of I did the actual like scattering kind of thing. And but that's a one difference between this and Pretend, is that kind of, it's hard to see. But I think it's mostly just the French accent. And then the quotation marks, I believe that was in the original too, kind of just thinking about, again, with like kind of the impenetrability and like how your mind is like looking at an umlaut and trying to make it something else when you don't know what it means or what it signifies, and you're just kind of thinking like visually and in terms of characters, I think, at that point. Like, so I wanted a sense of that, and I wanted the reader to be kind of disoriented, right? Because that is what she's going through, and that is like kind of the experience of translation and migration and all these things. So
it worked. It was kind of a weird, both being like thrown out of the book and being sucked further in at the same time. It was like, what is, and you're, by that point, you're so committed in this world, in her world. It was very cool. It works really well. I want to gear shift back to another sort of thread in the book, which feels sort of slightly uncomfortable because of how violent and dysfunctional a lot of it is. But also it's very sexy.
Oh no.
There are so many, like, it does have quite like an unapologetic, quite visceral sexiness to it that is very, to me, read very like Garth Greenwell, Andrea Lawler-esque, of just being like, and here's the fucking, and it happens because that's what happens. And you have, it's like the way she writes about like, I've always been a slut for accents. And it's from the beginning, there's a quality to it that is quite sexy, and sex is throughout. And tell me about writing a sexy book.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad that came through. I mean, like, sex is very important to me. Writing about sex is important. I think a large part of it is just keeping myself entertained in the narrative. I didn't want to have a boring book. I wanted the pacing to be very quick. I wanted people to be engaged. I mean, some people are just going to be turned off by sex stuff too. And I don't think at the time I was thinking this, but I think like in the beginning there's sex that's kind of like awkward and uncomfortable, and like having realistic sex is also, because there's so much bad sex in fiction. Like there's that prize that they award whatever for bad writing, and it's always this kind of like obscuring of like genitals or like euphemistic language, and so I wanted to break out of that. I think just to me there's something political about just like having queer sex, right? And having good queer sex and bad queer sex, And then what else about that?
Do you think of it as a sexy book?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. People have said I'm good at writing, like, I'm funny and I'm good at writing sex. Those are those two consistent things people tell me.
I will, as a reader, I will affirm those things. But like, yeah, because even the bad sex, or the sex that she experiences, which is bad sex, is brilliantly written and very visceral. And it's uncomfortable to read in the context of a book that is like, whether it's the good sex or the intimacy, that having all the kinds of sex, queer and not queer. Can sex ever be not queer if it involves a queer person, even if it's heterosexual sex? Like, is all the sex she's having queer?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, like, she's doing sex work at one point. She's doing
Yeah.
like phone operating. Like, is that? I think it depends how you define sex and how you define all of those words, heterosexual and queer. I would say, like, the sex that a queer person is having is always, but like, you can, I don't know, there's like stereotypes of like, to have the queer sex, it must be like, like anal sex, or it must be like XYZ kind of thing. But I think if, like, the way she relates to her body, even though she's not like using they them pronouns or identifying as genderqueer, like, is to me very queer. And there are those moments where she like, of the slippage where she says like my cock and stuff like that, as she like is sort of inhabiting and like kind of moving between roles. So I would say maybe it's all queer, but oh, and there's one thing I wanted to say before about the sex too. So the one of the ideas I was thinking about with translation theory is this idea of fidelity.
Right.
It's, are you being faithful to the source text? Are you being faithful to the author? So the thing about the slut for accents and all that stuff, I was like, what if we just take this idea to its like logical end, and we have a translator who's just completely unfaithful, you know? And then we can think about, well, like, what about Constantine? Like, what does he owe her? Is he faithful to her? Does that matter? And then, yeah, I don't know. I wanted to kind of turn that on its head and subvert it by having her just be like, yeah, I'm just gonna have sex with lots of people, and I think the term fidelity is like a very loaded word, and like I think we need to think beyond that and beyond that binary of faithful or unfaithful, and think about, you know, like for people who are in open relationships or like what does that look like? You know, things like it, just making it more expansive. I think.
I think it's very hard to have linear questions about this book, because some aspects of it kind of dovetail in where, you know, and there you're talking about like these expressions of gender, and it's both playful in the book and also worn so lightly, you know, it's a big part of her identity. It's also not, it's conscious, but it's not, and self-aware, but it's also not something she seems altogether all that invested in spending a lot of time analyzing as far as her everyday life is concerned. But then there are also other genderqueer characters, or characters that are expressing gender in different ways throughout the book, and it's just a part of that, which was very cool. But that playfulness and that idea of like gender or performance, or like what is translated or what is perceived, or how an audience reads a person or reads a text, seem to itself be part of the play you were playing with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think like in terms of performance, I'm very like subscribed to the idea that we're all performing gender and we're all performing everything, and like one of the things I was really trying to get at is that like identity is not this stable thing. Like it's useful maybe to have labels, to have communities, and to meet people who like have similar views or live a similar way, but it's so hard to pin people down like that. And it's like a fiction that we like have about ourselves and stuff. But like the very beginning, just when she like passes through that border, and then her name becomes different, which isn't like a thing, but like the way people pronounce your name will become different immediately, you know. So this idea of like I'm one thing, and people change over the course of that. Right, your sexuality might change, your gender might change. I think of her very much as someone who's like on a gender journey, but maybe not at like the end of that gender journey in this book. So I forget what the question was.
No, but I don't even think I put a question on that. But I think part of that, even in the way, for instance, like people get and seem to be all right with that Jeanne, Jeanne, Jean moment. But as soon as she's like John, and then I want to be called John, and then there's this like, does that mean you're trans? And she's like, no, I just like right now I feel like John, and John is the name. And that's the line that Constantine seems to draw. Where it's just like, it's in the word that is being chosen, that it's like you cannot have a woman called John, which is when presented in amongst all of those other ways of looking at words and language and gender, suddenly seems really ridiculous.
I mean, it is, but like it's still like unusual. Like we haven't gone very far as a society, I think. Like if like a cis man is wearing like I mean, I guess I'm saying this in Scotland, so maybe it's different because of kilts, but like you can't, like you're facing violence immediately if you're a cis man wearing a piece of fabric. You know, like I just think that's like pitiful, terrible in so many ways. Not to even speak of all of the other stuff, right? But yeah, that's very much like there's this like kind of tussle throughout the book and tension, struggle between them of like he doesn't really like accept her identity. He doesn't really like think she's a real translator. He doesn't really accept like
anything. Really.
Nothing. He's not. Which to me is like you don't really love someone then if you're not really understanding them or taking the time. But yeah, I just think we put all of this weight into like the gender of names and the importance of names and naming, and I would like it to be much more freer, fluid as a society. You know, I think it would maybe be super disorienting if people change their names like every day, but like I do know like children who do that kind of thing, you know, or like it's like every so often they'll change their name, and I think that's, I don't know, I just think it's part of growth, and we're like really limiting ourselves by trying to like put everything into boxes that need to like stay stable, because language also changes over time, right? The meanings of words change over time.
And but also there's that choosing that I think is so beautifully articulated in her, in that way of like she perceives a change in herself and it's important to name it in some way without having to explain it. It's just like, here is something that signifies to you that something has changed, and I'm telling you this is. But there must have been a lot of thought going into how you then picked those names and how deliberate you were. Was it always Jeanne, Jean, John?
I think John maybe came last. I wanted one for like while she was in England, and then I was thinking about just this institution of marriage and the idea of like taking someone's name, and are you taking something away from them? And there was actually like a law in Quebec that women cannot take their husband's last names, which is interesting. It might be gone now, but it definitely for a long time, and I thought that was interesting, and just all the people I know who've like changed their last names, but even that I think is like a weird, like I think there's always this assumption of like, oh, like it's normal and patriarchy and you want to be subsumed or something, or it makes things easier. It does make, like my mom didn't change her last name, and people were always like, are you actually, were you kidnapped or were you or people can hyphenate their name. But anyway, a lot of the women I know who've changed their names in marriage, it's to get away from their family name because there's some sort of abuse involved, you know, which I think is like there's just this assumption that's totally incorrect. I think. But anyway, I was like, what if someone were to change their first name, and what if I don't know, the matter of fact of it again I thought was very like political. I didn't want it to be like an after school special of like, and now she's trans and we're gonna explain what trans is for a cis audience because that'll be fun for that, like, you know. I wanted people to kind of just catch up or already be part of it, or I think I'm okay with people not understanding everything about the book.
I also there's something very human in being like, you don't need to know everything about this person to be able to respect the fact that this is a decision and that makes it legitimate by virtue of the choosing to do it. And I like that Nat in there is like just gets it, and there's always going to just be someone who gets it. I want to talk a little bit about the way you explore translation and the politics of translation in the book, because it is central to the character, and you do kind of make a political case in some ways. Like there is literally an argument between her and Constantine. Is it with Constantine where
Slash their publisher, I guess.
Yes, and there are these tensions that recur around translation. One of like whether the original will always be better, whether a translation is something that should invisibilize the translator so as to stay as true to the original, or whether or not you've created something entirely new which requires an acknowledgement and not an invisibilization of the translator, and how the world then receives that. So that's sort of three questions. But yeah, can you tell me a little bit about like, what you were exploring, like how you think about translation?
Sorry to go back.
Yes.
One thing was the visibility. What was the thing right before that? There was something else.
Right before that.
Aaron and Constantine arguing.
So the argument with Constantine was about whether the original was better.
Oh, okay, that was it. Yes.
And like that idea of being as true to the original as possible. So we start with that idea of like, is that the duty of the translator to create a replica, and is that even possible across language?
I forget, it might be Edward Gusson or someone, but they say like translation is both impossible and very necessary, right? It's like we have to try, but like it's a complete, fiction that we could, make a magic the book into another language, right? But it's interesting that you were saying about the original, because Nicole Brossard, who wrote Mauve Desert, she said that the English translation of the book was going to be better than her original. Like she was that invested in her translators and had like very close relationships with them and was such an advocate. And that's so rare, I feel like, now that you see anyone who's saying that. And it's always assumed to kind of be the opposite.
It is rare.
Yeah. And I think my point was just, I think they're both works of art, and you're making a new work of art that stands on its own, I think, with a translation. And it's just as important. I think just Jennifer Crothy was like, the translator picked every single word in that book, so they did like make something, and it definitely is. Constantine does not think this, but it definitely is creative. It definitely like takes a lot of work, which then goes into the visibility thing, right? Because I think like a lot of types of work, and it is often very like gendered. I think the majority of translators are women, probably. I believe that's right, white women, which is like a whole other can of worms we could talk about. But it's like if they've done their job correctly, much like a maid or something, you won't know that they did anything, right? You won't know. And like a lot of people will sometimes see books, and if the translator's name is not on the cover, like they don't know it wasn't originally written in English. And then we have this idea of like reviewing translations and measuring and the standard is like, it's the idea of like domesticating versus foreignizing, but it's we don't want to know that it's from another language. We want to be very comfortable. We want to have assimilated. We want to like use all the slang that's in our language.
Right.
And a lot of translators are very against that, and they want to kind of like leave in these almost like rough edges that remind you that you're reading a translation.
Right.
So, I mean, I think there's things that are valuable in both those kind of strands. But I think the visibility, to me, there's been like quite a movement for that, and like, was it the Heartland that just won? Yeah, this idea of like sharing prizes between the translator and the author.
Yeah.
And you know, there's like the opposite is true. Like a bad translation can like hurt a work of art. There's a lot of like violence you can do with translation if you're not like doing it carefully or like putting your heart into it, I guess. There's a lot of terrible translations and like harm that's been done. But I think I was trying to talk about this sort of like labor issue is how I see it. It's just like it's really hard to make a living translating. It's really hard to get recognition. It's still really looked down upon in some sects of society. The translation, like, and that's crazy to me that we're like this far again. And it used to be kind of the opposite. It was like you were paid really well in like ancient, like the days of kings, if you were a translator, and it's kind of flipped. And now we're into this world of like AI, and so it's like it should be free. Everything should be free, and translation is the same thing that a robot can do, and it's obviously not. In the same way that like a robot could write a book, but I don't want to read the book.
There's so much meat in that answer, and also in like all the nuances of the way you talk about it in the book. I went to an event way back, like about 10 years ago, with it was Per Pedersen, who I think is a Scandinavian writer, who was saying on stage, you know, I feel really weird being at this festival because I speak English, and I'm paraphrasing because it's been a decade, because I speak English and I can sit here and you think I'm the writer, but the book you've read is a lot better than the book I wrote in the original, and so my translator should be sitting here telling you about the book. And it was, you could tell like the room was kind of shocked by that, and he said it in partly a self-deprecating way, but also like dead serious. For him it was this like, he could read it he couldn't possibly have written it in English, but he could read it in English, and so he was looking at it quote unquote objectively and being like, this is a better book. Like it's, you know, and I find it interesting, that tension, the way you explore it. And in the book, there's this idea of recognition of being like, she gets to the point where she sees the book in a bookshop and she writes her name on the cover. And it is such a strange, almost imperial tradition that we celebrate that rights are sold for translation, to take an English book into global markets and have it translated into other languages. But we don't respect the people who bring other worlds into English. It's just assumed that's...
There's like so much inequality. Like I'll be here all night if I talk about like languages. I'm sure you know this from your like it's very uneven. It's very like which languages get funding, which languages are seen as having prestige, and then like what was I gonna say? Just talking about translation.
Like this imperial thing of going out versus coming back in.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a market. Obviously there's a market for British writers all over the world. Everyone wants to read what we have to say. But we don't have a market for the translated book, so we almost have to hide that it's translated.
Right.
Except if it's Japanese and has a cat on the cover. In which case it's very important that you know.
Right.
But I've also heard from publishers that for those books, translators have been asked to add the appearance of a cat or a tea, but mostly the cat. It's like, even if there isn't a cat in the original, that there has to just be something and that gets okayed by the writer, because the market wants a certain
Yeah.
kind of Korean or Japanese novel.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That makes sense to me. I think it's like, yeah, the assumed demands, right? Or like the assumed market has determined the content for the writers even.
Yeah.
And also like a lot of the major Japanese translators are white. That's like
Right.
another big thing. So yeah,
I mean, I think for any reader that's like interested in the tensions in
Mhm.
translation, that doesn't want to read theory,
yeah.
this is like the perfect vehicle for those like meaty conversations.
Well,
about
and
that.
you made the whole I don't know who made it, but the books about fiction,
Yes.
about translation. There is a lot of great fiction about translation.
Yeah.
The thing I was going to say before that I totally forgot, this idea of like, because you said imperial, like this idea that we need to know all of the literature in the world, or that we should have access to everything. I think there's some things we don't get access to.
Right.
You know, I think we don't. Not everything needs to be translated, or not everything is meant for like English speaking.
Right. Yeah, of course.
But yeah, I think it's like 3% of books in America are in translation, right? It's so little still.
Yeah. And then even then, it's mostly men, and it's a certain kind of either literary or worthy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's extremely racist. I think that probably goes without saying, but I'm gonna say it as many times as
Do you see your book being translated?
I would love that. Yeah.
Do you have like languages that you want to see it in?
I mean, any language that would like, have
And
it
anyone can have it.
I mean, I think there's like areas or maybe countries that would be more like places that have been colonized maybe are more interested in this kind of dialogue.
Yeah.
I put in my contract, actually not with this book but with Pretend, that the translator would get all of my royalties if the book was translated.
Oh, cool.
So I was really trying to like stand on what it's easy to give away money that you don't have, but but I felt very strong, and there was also a clause that said that their name had to be on the front cover if it was translated. So yeah.
Cool.
I would love for the book to be translated. I think it would be like kind of challenging to translate in ways.
Yes.
But I think that's exciting and interesting. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Do we have any questions? Do you have any questions? And I will also check the online chat as well.
I'd love to hear a bit more about the kind of scope that's focusing on language, on different languages, and one person having a different relationship to different languages, but even just the kind of, that sense of, even in philology, like language as a building block and then as a construction or a deconstruction of meaning, and what that gave you as you were writing it, even in terms of, like, you mentioned terms taken as like, oh my pop or something, like, when if there were mistakes with language that you got to play with, or the idea of changing meaning in different languages because you were using different ones, or because you've got French that's a gendered language and English that isn't. You know, just the kind of, what kind of playfulness you got out of that.
Okay. There's definitely some like intentional mistake, like where she says like she almost says word John instead of I'm, because she has all these selves with, and that was also kind of the point, is like all these versions are her, but they're different, and they are translations, and she is a translation, and like, but they're all valid and they're all her. I think that was part of what I was trying to do. And then, French is heavily gendered. So I'm trying to remember like what I did. I did a lot with like etymology and like taking things very literally. Like I think that I talk about a lot of like sayings, like this French saying for like what is called in English, I guess, a hendu. It's like enterrement de jeune. It's like burial of the life of a young woman, literally. So I did a lot of stuff around that, of just like, what are we actually saying with it? Or like there's like window licking in the beginning. That's another French term. So yeah, thinking about these like idioms, I guess. And then
lèche vitrine.
Yeah.
I'd never thought about it. Yeah, it's funny when you have something translated and then you have to think about the literal meaning of it.
Yeah.
And you're like, I know that's weird.
But like it's not weird to be like there's plenty of things like in English that we don't think
No,
about, you know,
of course.
where like pigs can fly. It's like, well, what yes, just
Yeah,
a thing you
yeah,
say. Like,
yeah.
Gender. I mean, and the part I read was kind of about like diagramming a sentence, basically like a linguist would, and thinking about that. I think I talk about écriture inclusive and this idea of like, can we make things gender neutral? Is that a good idea? Like, because that often leads to like more problems. I know, like in Spanish, I listened to one translator talking about like how do you do the gender neutral in Spanish, and people do the X, but it's hard to pronounce. Some people do the E, and then people were doing like the @ symbol, but it was like causing problems for people with disabilities because the readers couldn't like really understand the @ symbol.
Right.
So there's just like a lot of intersecting things, and then in terms of like the building blocks of language, like I talk about kind of Worfianism and like this idea of like I think it's impossible that like the languages or language you speak doesn't imbue like your life in some way or like have some influence. But yeah, they've done studies on like bilingual brains and like which parts are more developed, and like I think I talk about this idea of like where responsibility is distributed based on like kind of how verbs work in certain languages, and I think that one is the Spanish example. But when you say like the vase broke on me versus like I broke the vase, and how you're like forced to attribute blame with certain languages. So yeah.
Cool. There was a question online from Charlotte.
Hi,
That
Charlotte.
was saying, how does your own mood affect how you write your translations? And I think in the book there's this bit where it's just like her mood affects what words she's choosing.
Yeah.
That will make it more or less miserable.
Yeah, I mean, because you were talking about like saying it's better than his book, like that had to be a very generous and open-hearted translator kind of thing, but also maybe someone who's kind of editing the work as they're going.
Right.
But Jeanne or Jeanne in the book, she's like pissed at Constantine basically, and so she's like taking the least charitable meanings of every word. And yeah, I think the way I do it in translating is similar to writing, where it's like depending on my mood, it might be imparted into the translation in a certain sense.
Right.
And I try to come at it with like the most generous again, and like there's sometimes when you like feel like you're really clicking with the author that you're translating, and like where it's like coming through you almost, and you're channeling it ideally, and like and then when it doesn't work, I think I have a tendency to be like, well, maybe this isn't that good. Maybe the thing I'm translating isn't. And then you just kind of have to come back to yourself and like kind of try to concentrate on like, well, you're just looking for patterns, I guess, usually, or I am. You're looking for like, well, what are their kind of tics? Yeah. What are their, is there alliteration? It's like very similar to kind of analyzing maybe a poem or something like that, translating a poem.
Right.
Because you're trying to think about like what they were thinking when they wrote it, which is a very hard thing to do, and it's like time travel almost. So yeah, it's weird.
Carl asked, would you want to be involved in your own translation? How do you feel about bridge translations?
100% sure what a bridge is. That when there's both languages on either side of the page, or is that?
I think it's when you have like a translator will translate the poem, but then it's another writer that turns it back into a poem.
Okay.
So you can have someone who doesn't understand the original language. You can put in the chat if that's not what you meant. But yeah, so you can be like, I want this poet who knows my work to do, but they don't speak the original language. So you have an in-between, someone who does meat and potatoes bridge.
Yeah, I mean, off the bat, I don't love that idea.
You're like, ew.
I don't know. It was like a big thing. I think when Biden was elected, and he had, I forget her name, but he had this slam poet at his inauguration.
Yes.
And it was like a big deal of like who different countries were picking to translate her. And I think like Sweden picked someone who was like a slam poet who wasn't a translator, and then other countries would pick like, but it was like their identity mirrored. It was like a black person who like had, you know, works with like the kind of rhythms she's using.
Okay.
And that is like a whole nother question of like, should the identity of the translator mirror that of the writer? And I think that's the same kind of question of like, can people write about different types of people? I think it's like, you can do whatever you want, but you have to do a good job, or people like that group is going to come for you, and they are right to come for you, and that's fine, kind of thing. But would I want to be involved in my own translation? Yeah, I think dependent. If it's like a language I know for sure, you know, if it was like Italian or French, I wouldn't want to be overbearing. I feel like I like to give people like free reign. I think that's my impulse. But yeah, I know translators who have all kinds of like really like there's some people who like the author doesn't speak English at all, and so they're just like good luck kind of thing, and they can't ask them questions about it, which is hard. Or you're translating someone who's dead, so you really can't ask them questions about it.
Yeah, of course.
And then sometimes authors get a little overly involved, is what I have heard. And they just they're very particular, and they you know want to. I don't know. It's like you already wrote the book. Why would you want to write it again? Kind of thing. Yeah, I think I would like to be involved in like a helpful and positive way, but I think I wouldn't.
But like, what did you mean by this?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a play on words. Were you intending this effect or this effect? Because it might affect the words I'm choosing.
Yeah.
Rather than.
Yeah. Yeah, because they'll be like, I mean, this happens with literary interpretation too, right? Like, they'll be like, were you thinking of this thing? And they'll be like, absolutely not. So, yeah, but it would be hard too if someone you felt like didn't really do you justice, and then your book didn't. I just feel like most professional literary translators now, they're so fucking good. Like, they've worked really hard to be where they are. There's a bunch of people who like aren't even at like that professional level who are really, really fucking good. So, and even people who are like new to translation, like my students when I'm teaching translation theory or I'm doing like workshops or whatever, it's like really fun actually, and their brains are like creative and interesting in new ways if you're like new to translation. And you're making like kind of different neural pathways, so I like that too actually.
Cool. I think we are at time. I had loads more questions, and by questions I mean quotes that I had written down that were, which, like looking back on it, one of them is, he had a petite handlebar mustache and smoked with a French accent, which is like the most vivid description of a person ever. And the other one was, first she must finish Squirt Girl 2 and her shrimp cocktail, which just sounds like the worst night ever. It's just like, I have a meeting to go to, but first porn and shrimp.
There's a porno theater in Montreal called Café L'Amour or Cinema L'Amour. And that's where I got the names from. I just looked up like what was screening then. And I wanted it to be like, it's another thing where I'm talking, I think I said like she comes with a French accent or something like that. Where it's like some of the titles are in English, some of the titles are in French, and that like liminality is really interesting to me. So yeah.
Well, the book is full of beautiful turns of phrase. It's so brilliantly written. It was so much fun to read. Thank you so much. Thank you for questions. Thank you for questions. And do pick up a copy of the book. It's available online or at the till. And thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to go up and press pause on this before we have, do-do-do,